Hello, everybody, and good evening. It's me, Don Arleth, and it's time for World Talk, so let's get started. Today, another major conference on the post-war reconstruction and integration of Ukraine to the EU is taking place in Rome, Italy. Yet at the same time, day after day, Russia continues to ramp up attacks on the civilian population in the capital of Kyiv and other cities across the country. Now joining me to discuss the multiple dimensions of this political gathering in Italy is Mark McNamee, co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, good evening, and thanks for joining me, Mark.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Yes, so as Ukraine, continues to face these escalating attacks on civilians, do you think it's premature right now to focus on reconstruction? And is that why we're seeing such the broad array of topics there at that conference there in Italy?
Yes, for sure. And actually, it's a good question because that's something we hear on the ground in Ukraine from Ukrainians all the time is reconstruction. What reconstruction? When last night we were hiding in the shelter, we were hiding in our bathrooms, dealing with these air raids. Why are we talking about reconstruction after the war when we're dealing with a very real war currently? But a couple of points that I would highlight, among other reasons why I think we should be talking about the long term, and these conferences, held annually are important. One is that they are responding to current circumstances. One of the major sort of upgrades or updates of this conference in Rome compared to the previous years is the very clear focus on defense. And it's for this reason that these air raids, as has been well published lately, the first half of this year, Russia launching 2 times the amount of drones that they launched in all of 2024. Launching record levels, numbers of missiles as well. So this air raid campaign day after day across the country, Europe is really recognizing and responding by focusing, concentrating on defense at the conference itself. And defense in 2 ways. One is, of course, providing more air defense, more support, more military support at the front to repel the Russians. So just the military aspect, but also the economic aspect. The defense sector has already become an engine of growth here. That is a clear driver of investment, and it's well recognized in the defense community around the world that Ukraine is already and is becoming the hub of Western defense technology, manufacturing, et cetera, for the next generation. And that's happening before our eyes literally in the last 2+ years. So those components are quite important at this conference, and it relates, of course, to current circumstances with the extreme attacks that Ukraine is facing.
Right now, 10 billion euro so far has been pledged today at the conference, and I imagine this is probably going to go straight into defense production. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about how Ukraine can actually help Europe. Here we are over 3 years on in this war, and Europe is still, it doesn't really have its act together in terms of ammunition production or heavy equipment and other military production. That's still lagging. Is it possible that we could see Ukraine, as it ramps up its production, could it help Europe actually achieve some goals in what it's setting out to do over the next 5 years?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the lessons learned that Ukraine can share with Europe is just massive, and that's already well understood. And you're not wrong to say that Europe hasn't gotten its act together, but I would also say concretely, and this is based upon what I'm seeing on the ground here with Europeans coming here, but also hearing it from the top experts, from NATO leaders, former NATO leaders, European military leaders. Europe is getting its act together is probably more appropriately how we should frame it, and they're doing it rapidly. It's not rapid enough, of course. We always want things faster, but they are moving in the right direction and quickly, so that's obviously very, very encouraging. But the key component here is that we need to bridge the gap until the combined forces of all the NATO countries, so the combined forces of the United States and the European countries, they can provide more support for Ukraine, which is going to take some time because Europe, again, is just getting its act together now. But in the meantime, that's where the Ukraine component comes in. Europe has the cash. Ukraine has the know-how. Ukraine just needs to scale. So the gap here to bridge for the next 6 months, year and a half, is Europe providing that capital to the Ukraine domestic defense industry here that's been rapidly advancing. And then that will give the Ukrainians the necessary scale to bridge this gap for the next, say, year and a half, while Europe gets its act together and they start producing adequate levels on their own. And the United States, by the way. I don't want to think, and especially the last week, we're much more encouraged, of course, by U.S. support, Trump's rhetoric, commitment to Europe and Ukraine's security. So the combined forces, we remain optimistic, we remain positive for Ukraine for the future. But yes, we have to bridge that gap, and we're doing that.
Yeah, and the United States actually has quite a bit of weapons. Germany also pledging to buy Patriot missile systems for Ukraine, which are very expensive. I guess the big question now is, will the United States, will President Trump want to sell this very expensive military equipment that's desperately needed over here? When do you think we're going to see a breakthrough on that? Or will we see a breakthrough on that?
I think we're seeing it. Trump has given indications now for about the last 5 to 6 weeks that he'd be willing to sell equipment, and particularly the air defense equipment. And then in the last week, he's given much more clear indication that that's the trajectory of travel here, that we are going to move that, and that's more or less imminent. And especially a willingness to sell it. There's really no reason why Trump would stop that. And we know from the rhetoric from Trump, he's clearly fed up and frustrated with Putin. He's said that publicly for about the last month plus, and then very vehemently in the last week. So it looks like, again, Trump's policy is moving in the right direction here. So U.S. will, for the future, continue to provide that support. Plus, we're not talking about sanctions too much, but that is the other key component here, of course. Aligned U.S. and EU sanctions to undermine Russia's ability to continue to finance and prosecute the war at such a high level. But staying more on the defense side, we should be encouraged by everything we've seen and heard over particularly the last week, coming out of both Europe and the United States in terms of providing support and specifically air defense. But again, the point I want to stress here is Ukraine becoming reliant on its own, becoming its own deterrent against Russia, which is what's going to have to happen over the long term. And Ukraine is doing that. And a good example of that is literally just in the last 2 months, as Russia's been setting these record levels of drone attacks, Ukraine has developed on their own technology to actually bring down high levels of numbers of drones at a much reduced cost compared to the much more expensive Western air defense systems. So the more Ukraine can rely on its own technology and its own manufacturing base, but then also not relying on such expensive equipment coming from the West, then Ukraine, of course, will be in a much, much better position, particularly at this crucial moment where Russia is producing and then using and attacking with far higher levels of drones than they did at any point last year or the year before.
Right, and it looks like we'll see probably Ukraine ramp up its interceptor drones production, something that is just kind of breaking right now. I'd like to move on to the effects of these attacks in Ukraine. For one, how do you think that these attacks are affecting businesses? I mean, I can imagine, I've on recent trips to Ukraine, I've had the same problem, not being able to sleep at night and then having to work the next day because of the drone attacks. Tell me, how is this affecting local businesses, the economy in Kyiv? And is there a perception of heightened danger, of risk to people's lives that we might see people leave the city?
Yeah, so to date, we haven't seen people leaving in the center and western regions, not near the front. We haven't seen people leaving, but you're absolutely correct. I live in Ukraine. I've lived here now for about 2 years. My family and friends here, yes, there's a palpable, much more prominent sense of worry, of the psychological fatigue, of just living through, not necessarily your building being hit, but just living through night after night after night of these high levels of attacks, and what happens next week, what happens in a month, is there enough air defense? And yeah, of course, just sleepless nights. And it does, it impacts the economy. Our business here, so UBI Network, we are talking to the largest Western multinational corporations invested here. We talked to some of the largest Ukrainian, so the domestic companies here. And really, since the beginning of the year, there has been, unfortunately, it's unfortunate to report this, but kind of month after month, just a more degradation of sentiment and concerns about how long can the economy sort of last? And one of the major components of that is not just the psychological fatigue, but also the impact on inflation because of the destruction of the energy sector. And so, unfortunately, you have high energy costs, and then also with the labor market, high labor costs because so many men taken out for mobilization to go serve in the military. So those two costs, unfortunately, are going to remain, and that does deteriorate sentiment. In addition, of course, to the air raids themselves and how that sort of dampens demand from customers for these multinational corporations as well as the domestic Ukrainian companies.
And I can imagine that this is also having a negative effect on, companies who are willing to risk capital, money on investing in Ukraine when the security situation isn't quite worked out yet.
Yeah, that's true to a degree. But what I would commend a lot of the companies that have stayed, and most of the companies, by the way, have stayed from the full-scale invasion through to today. Very few companies are even considering leaving. So they are definitely invested for the long term, and they have continued to invest further. What I would say is that there's a number of companies, though, that have actually been doing extraordinarily well, and they're investing much further. We don't report a lot of those stories, unfortunately, but they should be championed because there are a lot of bright spots in the economy, and there's a lot of companies that are actually doing extremely well the last couple of years, have returned already back. About half of our client base have already returned back to 2021 levels of demand. Profitable corporations as well. So there are a lot of sort of bright spots in the economy and some very positive stories, but unfortunately, amid all of the trauma that we see every day, they're not very well reported. And I'm saying that because unfortunately that deters the investors on the outside who are looking in, right? Some of them who were considering investments before, but with the full-scale invasion, they decided to delay things. And now all they see, unfortunately, are drones and missiles, and they don't see how well a lot of consumer goods companies, how well logistics companies, how well chemicals companies, down the list, how many are doing actually very well the last several years.
Indeed. Well, hopefully we're on the cusp of some new developments and changes in the political sphere coming for positive effect for Ukraine. Mark McNamee, I very much appreciate you joining us today, co-founder, Ukraine Business News Network. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more here on TVP World.